Good. So let's go through this very quickly. The topic is arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And here in Padua, I really do not have to explain what this is. So how should we approach a patient with arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy? When do you suspect that? In the typical case, this is a young adult, a sportive adult, who has palpitations or a syncope or an aborted sudden cardiac death. So what is important then is to take an ECG and an echo, and very important, the family history, and finally the genetics. So this is reflected in the current ESC guidelines. I think very nice, this approach described there. You start with symptoms and or clinical signs. Then you assess the phenotype by imaging and ECG. And then you put everything in the genetic and clinical context. So the phenotype is important. And the phenotype is known to slowly progress over time. So what I like to show you are 3 examples of our ARVC clinic. One is at where you see the green number 1. So it's almost, it's a concealed stage. One is at the electrical stage and one at the heart failure stage. So very quickly, this is a 27-year-old female. Her brother has a known arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. For this reason, genetics was done by a cascade screening. She has a PKP2 gene mutation. And this is a very interesting situation for us in the clinic. Her echo is almost normal. The only pathological finding you have in this echo is the longitudinal strain, which is reduced. So this is, I just show this to illustrate the value of strain for early detection of a phenotype like this. This is another patient in the arrhythmic stage. This one was a medical student when everything started, and he had a syncope during physical exertion while he played soccer. He also has a PKP2 mutation, and this is evident for you. This is a more advanced phenotype. The right ventricle is not normal. There is a subtricuspid aneurysm, and there is a secondary tricuspid regurgitation. And so here, of course, the strain is reduced, but you don't really need it because you see other things which are pathological in this echo. This finally is a patient in the heart failure stage, and this is how they all look like when they get to that stage. And in principle, and this is a fontan-like circulation, and this is an almost inexistent function of the right ventricle. And very interesting to see here, you have a diastolic forward flow in the pulmonary artery here. Can you see the cursor? Yes. This here is a diastolic forward flow in the pulmonary artery, which is always a sign that right ventricular function is completely deteriorated. And what I personally find very interesting is this modern concept of end-diastolic forward flow in the pulmonary artery. Previously, that was just the small, stiff, hypertrophic ventricle. But now we have the fallow ventricle as an example. But now I think we have a different perspective on that. This you can also see in dilated ventricles where there is not much or no hypertrophy. And in these instances, the pericardial space is limiting the dilation of the ventricle and promoting this end-diastolic forward flow. So what about the imaging approach in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy? We have the 2010 task force criteria, and of course we have the Padua criteria, and we are convinced in Zurich that we should use both of these sets of criteria. So what you see up there is the 2010 task force criteria, but let's be honest, this is still considered a gold standard by many people, but this is really on a very simple level, and these are only very few parameters which appear there, and down there you see what should also be assessed. In principle, you need a complete echo. And this will also be reflected in this new publication, which is submitted now to circulation, where this 2010 task force criteria will be revised. Everything in front of a genetic background, but it will be much closer than to the Padua criteria. So when I wrote as a co-author together with Barbara this chapter on the echo in ARVC, I started to read a lot, and I realized that there are many holes in our knowledge. And when I started to read about the RVOT diameter, which is one of these criteria here, it is in principle the only dimensional criterion which is in these recommendations, then I realized there are too many open questions. So we decided to run a project, and we collaborated with others. We were able to collect 370 patients with definitive arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy and genetic testing available. So this is a pretty useful cohort. And we studied the RVOT diameter, all of them which appear in the literature. I can make this simple. It does not matter with which one you work, whether it is RVOT1, RVOT2, or RVOT3. You should not, they are all comparable. Huh? You should not use RVOT4 because reproducibility is lousy. And what we saw here in this work with Thierry Donati is that when the RVOT diameter increases with the severity of the disease. What was interesting to us is to see that there are about 20% of patients with an isolated RVOT dilatation in the echo. So this is not MRI, so you don't have the volume mostly. You only have the area or the diameter of the right ventricle in modified apical four-chamber view. But in 20% of these patients, this is normal, and irrespective of this, the RVOT is dilated. And the RVOT diameter is definitely associated with survival. When you use the cutoffs published in the task force criteria, you can nicely separate between those with and without events. And what you see here is that this association with events is not linear, it's rather exponential. And this you can observe in primary prevention patients. That means patients who never experienced an arrhythmic event. You can, but you can not so well see it in those undergoing or suffering death. This relationship is not so clear as ventricular arrhythmia. And here on the right-hand side of this slide, we compared it with the strain, because strain now in echo is everywhere. Everybody loves it and everybody uses it, but it's not such a simple measurement, the strain. I personally think it's rather delicate. And this here is clear. The result, this the simple diameter has a better feasibility and a better reproducibility and even a stronger risk association than the strain. So we have good reasons to go back to such simple dimensional parameters in echo and to not forget them. And of course, the best is to run a multi-parametric approach where you use such simple dimensional parameters and the strain as well. So the other thing we started to look at is this up here, this aneurysm or sacculation item. Also there, we realized not so much is known. Nevertheless, it is recommended. It's the first point which should be checked. And I personally believe it is for diagnostics is a very, very useful parameter. These aneurysms and in particular the sacculations, the difference for us is the aneurysms is at least one segment of the RV and the sacculation is smaller than that. But this is really a very tightly associated finding with ARVC. But whether it has a prognostic association, it's not known, and the distribution is not known, and many other things as well. So we also looked into that. And here you see that about half of our 370 patients had these circulations, and the other half did not. And when you looked at the genotype, then this is particularly prominent in PKP2 patients, and it's a bit less in the other patients. So here the genotype seems to play a certain role. In contrast to the RVOT diameter, I forgot to say that before, when you study the RVOT diameter, the genotype of the patient does not seem to be relevant, neither for risk association nor for the rest. But here, the genotype seems to play a certain role. And when you look at the risk association here of the presence of these circulations, then there is some association with the risk for ventricular arrhythmia here. That's clear. But this is particularly pronounced in patients with PKP2 mutation. And in the others, this is non-PKP2, there's not so much of an association. So the genotype in this regard, in terms of the circulation, seems to be very important. And down here is just to support all that is the Cox regression analysis with an interaction analysis for the genetic status. This confirms that. So also in difference to the diameter, these circulations, they seem to occur particularly frequently in PKP2 mutation patients, and there they have a very strong association with the risk for ventricular arrhythmia. So now I have mentioned strain several times. Now let's focus a bit on strain after these dimensional morphological parameters. Strain is a new thing in echo, but in principle it is really fantastic because it has put echo on a different level. Why am I liking it so much, and all the echo people do it likewise? Because you can now really look at the myocardium. By following these speckles from frame to frame through the cardiac cycle, you can watch the myocardium per se, how it is changing its shape, the deformation. And this is something completely different from ejection fraction, because ejection fraction does just a change in volume. You kind of ignore the myocardium, so it's a completely different approach. And it's evident that to look at the myocardium per se must have some advantages. And this is clear here. That's the general concept for longitudinal strain, which is the strain parameter which has made it into clinical routine. This here is a normal individual, and you see clearly that ejection fraction results from a transversal shortening and a longitudinal shortening. It's both. And here you have an individual with amyloidosis, and what is clear here, even without quantifying anything by strain, you see it with your eye. The transversal shortening you still have, but the longitudinal shortening has been lost here. And this is explained by the thickness of the myocardium and all these proteins which accumulate there. This is in this very nice publication from Norway, is this quantified. So ejection fraction is a function of circumferential and longitudinal shortening, but the circumferential shortening contributes much more to ejection fraction than the longitudinal shortening. And from this follows that ejection fraction and GLS, global longitudinal strain, are kind of complementary. So ejection fraction is associated with outcome, with mortality. That's clear. Nobody doubts that. There is a lot of literature. But this is particularly below ejection fraction of 35%. There is a rather linear relationship here. But above 35%, there is no clear relationship. This is just a nice example for that, but in 8,000 patients almost. But you see that in many different publications as well. And the strain that's kind of complementary, this is particularly useful for outcome associations, for predictions above an ejection fraction of 35%. Why? Because this longitudinal deformation of the ventricle gets lost first before the transversal deformation gets lost. So this is complementary, this is nice. And there is a lot of outcome literature in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And you see here, you don't need to read that. That's just to document that there is a lot published. Strain is showing up again and again. So most of the prediction analyses have been done with strain in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And this offers particular advantages. When you remember the patient 1 I showed you, where the phenotype is virtually normal, only the strain is reduced. Yeah, when you see such patients, and we see them more and more often due to cascade screening, then you are alerted by this finding, and you will shorten the follow-up interval. In contrast, when the patient has everything normal, even the strain is normal, you can have a longer follow-up interval. So in addition to ventricular strain, you can also look at atrial strain. That's the new thing now. And you saw in the lecture before, you saw something on diastolic function. And the strain has now reached the main stage in diastolic function guidelines in echo. So this is really an important achievement for echo. So first we started in echo with the diameter here. And then we used the area. And then we used the volume of the atria, and we were quite proud because, yeah, that's the volume. But that's just the dimension, and we don't know anything about function there. And now with strain, this is really fantastic. We can look at function of the atrium because we understand the reservoir phase, the conduit phase, and the pump phase. So we applied that with Shehab Anwar in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And to summarize this paper very quickly, so you can determine the strain of the right atrium in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. You will find that 2/3 of the patients have a normal size of the right atrium, but almost all of them have a reduced function, a reduced reservoir strain of the atrium. And this reduced reservoir strain is associated with outcomes, not only atrial arrhythmia, but even ventricular arrhythmia. And in a follow-up paper with Shehab Anwar, we looked at the combination of right atrial and right ventricular strain. So to cut this story short, when you combine the two parameters, you have a better model for outcome prediction than when you use either component, the right atrium, the right ventricle alone. So we have an advantage here by looking not only at the ventricle, but also at the atrium. And in a way, this makes sense because it is a genetic disease and there is myocardium not only in the ventricle, but also in the atrium. But now we can extend that a bit and go to 4-chamber strain. And this is something we know quite well now for amyloidosis, where 4-chamber strain is an established concept. So this we looked at with Rodrigo Carrasco. This is he is still working on the manuscript, but I thought I bring that along for you because I like this data very much and maybe you're interested. So what we did first is we looked at the risk, the distribution of this risk in the population. And what is evident here is that the risk for ventricular arrhythmia, depending on the strain, this is always right ventricle, right atrium, left atrium, is rather linear, that's clear. But for death, when you look at death as the outcome, That's not linear at all. And this is something to keep in mind when you look at outcome associations in publications. The risk is not always linear. Also, we mostly assume that. But what we also see here, again, this is right ventricle, right atrium, left atrium, that the cutoffs, they are fairly well developed now in the strain literature. These are always, you see here with the red line, you see the cutoffs taken from the latest document published last year in JACE. So we have good cutoffs, but keep in mind we don't have a linear risk with the parameters. And here we tried to use four-chamber strain and compare and understand whether it offers an advantage for us in terms of risk prediction as compared to single chamber, let's say, right ventricular strain. And it does, but it depends on what parameter you look at. So here you have ventricular arrhythmia risk, and here you have the mortality risk. So this is a clinical approach, and it is a dichotomized decision. So we always just assess the risk by looking at, is the risk, is the strain normal or abnormal? And you see here with ventricular arrhythmia, when you start at right ventricle, add right atrium, left ventricle, left atrium, in each of these steps, you gain something. Here, with the death, sorry, I mixed it up. With the death, in each of these steps, with each cavity, you gain something in terms of your prediction model. But when you look at the arrhythmia, you do not. You only gain something with the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and the atria, they are here not helpful. And Rodrigo is now working on a continuous risk model, not a dichotomized risk model. He is struggling with that, but there we need a data-driven approach. So we are working on it. And the last 3 minutes, I can speak to you about something I like very much, that's tricuspid regurgitation. We thought, okay, cardiomyopathy, that's muscle in the heart, but it has implications for the heart. There is dilatation of the chambers, and it could, maybe this can affect the valves, and when the valves are concerned, this can affect the risk of the patient. So it's not good to look at muscle alone. And we looked at the impact of tricuspid regurgitation in patients with arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. So this is one example of a patient. We looked at this mister in 2009, 2022, and 2025. And you see there is a clear progression in the severity of tricuspid regurgitation. And this is in 95% of our patients. This now is even 500 patients, because we could also convince our colleagues in Boston and Baltimore to join us in this effort. So in these 500 patients, we had in 95% a secondary tricuspid regurgitation due to ventricular dilatation and annulus dilatation. And in only 5 or 6% it was a primary, and in very, very few patients it was the lead of the electrode. So how we assess that when it is possible is with a 3D. That's the best method, transthoracic 3D, but it's not always possible, this I admit. And now really very interesting data now to end up with. When you look at the impact of tricuspid regurgitation severity on survival probability, then it is evident that the more severe tricuspid regurgitation, the higher the risk. And the same applies to ventricular arrhythmia. And this is interesting now. When you only look at the tricuspid annulus, the dimension of the annulus, you have the same pattern. And here we look at Again, tricuspid regurgitation severity, and here at tricuspid annulus dimension in primary prevention patients versus secondary prevention patients. And it's clear that primary prevention patients have a lower risk than secondary prevention patients because once you have undergone a ventricular arrhythmia, you have a higher risk for ventricular arrhythmia. This is always the most important predictor of future events. Now, when you are in primary prevention, so you have never underwent a ventricular arrhythmia yet, and you have a high-grade tricuspid regurgitation, your risk is comparable to a patient in secondary prevention. And the same, even clearer, we see with tricuspid annulus dilatation. When you have a dilated tricuspid annulus leading to a severe tricuspid regurgitation, your risk is equalized to a patient in the secondary prevention. And this, I believe, is really an important finding which illustrates very well that we should not only look at the ventricle in such patients, we should also look at the atria, and even we should look at the valves. And again here, below there, you see that the genotype in this cohort of 500 patients doesn't play an important role when you look at it. So the phenotype is much more important here. So this is my summary, and I think I made it in these 30 minutes. Maybe it was a little bit fast, but I just couldn't resist to show these things because I like the data and it's interesting, and maybe we can have time for discussion. Thank you very much.